Baudelaire is in my book, and especially I wanted to mention this, that what he's writing about in the Artificial Paradise is his experiences with this group that seems to be an echo of Davy, which is the club of Hashishans, who all meet regularly once a month to ingest this new substance, which is this kind of jelly form of hashish, which seems to be incredibly powerful because they have pretty robust hallucinations when they take it, and investigate their states of mind. So Balzac is there, Gautier, another inheritor of Hoffmann, is there, Baudelaire's there in the wings, Delacroix, the painter, is there, and it's all run by a psychologist, by a psychiatrist. That's who secures the drugs, and that's who kind of guides the seance, which just means the session, right? It's not it looks like a seance, but it's just like a meeting. And why is he doing it? Very explicitly because he wants to investigate the artificial production of states of madness. Because he's interested in understanding the mad patients who he encounters and wants to know what they're going through and how can we simulate this and stimulate it by taking a drug. So they become very expert in recounting their experiences. And you're pointing out a really interesting bifurcation that this is still connected to the spaces of scientific and medical exploration and reflexive exploration, but then it branches into this realm of idealist art, of symbolist art, of experimental art, of experimenting with altered states, and then can connect it again with the mystical traditions, the perennial philosophy of the West in different ways. But again, in 1900, the bifurcation is never complete because they're always rejoining. In 1900, you've got the Society for Psychical Research, you've got theosophists, and you've got all kinds of people who are recovering esoteric traditions and also discovering esoteric traditions from India, from China, and bringing them, translating them into European languages. But the Society for Psychical Research is a bunch of people who are spiritualists, who want to, under experimental conditions, investigate the possibility of contacting the dead. Among their members are William James, Henri Bergson, but also physicists, Oliver Lodge, William Crookes. These are leading physicists at the end of the 19th century, just before Einstein and just before quantum mechanics, who are investigating, well, the relations between energy and matter and multiple dimensions. They're asking in different ways the exact questions that will lead to the huge revolutions in physics a couple decades later in the 20th century.
Just one more note on the issue of, because in Paris they had, it was a creative community that was taking the hashish, even though it was administered by a psychologist under somewhat scientific setting. But a friend of mine, an Australian, sent me an article that was written by Marcus Clarke in Australia. So Marcus Clarke is one of the most well-known Australian novelists. And in this essay, he talks about reading Thomas de Quincey about opium, and then he says, but to my knowledge, there hasn't been anyone who's taken a substance and tried to compose on the substance, not just using the substance as inspiration to write later. And so he goes to a doctor friend and then asks for some cannabis, and the doctor's like, well, if you're going to do it, I want to administer it carefully and observe you. And so the resulting essay has both the doctor's time-stamped external observations and a short story that was written while he was tripping. And so it's this really kind of interesting place where, again, the creative, putting into language and poetic impulse and the medical, methodology and watchful eye are coming together. So it definitely has a continuing history in the 19th century.
And that points out another point that what you were saying suggested to me, that it's about finding literary form. There's an inventiveness there, right? A new kind of literary form. It seems like really an interesting kind of genre where you've got the doctor's timestamp along with the story as it's unfolding. But that the ultimate impulse behind this systematization of experience and finding the language and finding the genre is to establish the grounds of communicability, right? To make it possible to speak with other people in reliable ways about something that should be ineffable. So it's ultimately about building, the communication community between the scientist and the poet, but also a community that can agree upon whatever it is they're talking about. It's building a world and building a social form.
And it's also building meaning and integration, because in order to have, to carry back something with you from the experience, you have to narrativize it and kind of weave that narrative into your life and the way that you see the world. So it's both about, intersubjective communication and, implanting, the seed of meaning or significance in the individual, I think.
There's two things that language could potentially do that would lead us in completely opposite directions, but I think maybe we should just speak about them. One, which we've been describing, is you're going to go off, you're going to have this incredible trip, we're going to take a substance, we're going to see what happens, we're going to record it, we're going to use language to try to bring it back into our world. Another, which you can find in mystical traditions, I'll talk about it in terms of, let's see, that's good. The Kaddish. Okay, so you may be familiar with the Jewish Kaddish, or you may not, but it's a poem of repetition to the glory of God. Yikadash, Yikadal, and there's all these wonderful repeating sounds. There are ways of approaching this language, which is not a language of immediate meaning. I mean, there's meaning there, but it would have been put together very differently if you weren't trying to create this kind of strange suspension of repeating sounds. It was recommended to do this at times without eating for a couple of days. To do it having performed certain physical exercises that would put your body and your mind into a state that would be receptive to the full force of the poem. Now, what do they mean by this? Do they mean the meaning of the poem? I don't think so. I think they're using language to help people transport themselves into a new state. So language, and this is a very beautiful poetic work, but it's really intended not just for us to listen to, but to be transported within that language frame.
I really love that wording, helping people transport themselves into the state. I think that's really accurate and gets to a lot of what Wordsworth and Coleridge talk about. It's not just the scene in nature, it's not just the poem, but it's the individual's consciousness meeting that poem or that scene in nature that has that effect. So
yeah. And another Shelley connection, one of the poems of his that I like the most, I don't know many of them, but this is a terrific one, is Ode to the West Wind. And it's addressing the west wind. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. So we're in the language and in the space of enchantment and of magic. And the last stanza, the last section, make me thy lyre, even as the forest is, what if my leaves are falling like its own? The tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both a deep autumnal tone. Sweet though in sadness, be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit. Be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. And by the incantation of this verse, scatter as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Which explicitly puts you in the space of enchantment and make my words an incantation. This is not just describing something, right? He is asking, he is imploring, he is addressing this other force to become him. So there's that intersubjectivity with a non-human force, and also to bring about a transformation. This is a spell he's trying to cast. I mean, these are words that are not just about changing a state of mind, but also bringing about a new something into the world, bringing something new into the world. So this magical force of language is another way in which language functions that the Romantics are very explicitly trying to bring back. Not just describing, not just communicating, but transforming, performing and transforming, shaping the world.
And it gets back to that insight that Davy had on nitrous, that the creative aspect of the world and the non-separation between creative consciousness and seemingly objective externalities. So
And I can talk a little bit more about that sort of point and how close it is to, well, a number of features of Romantic culture and science. Just this, there's no more exemplarily romantic text or object than the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, with the lyrics by Friedrich Schiller, which is all about this gleaming spark that unites what custom drew apart. There's a kind of connection among this new society of nature, right, that had been separated but needs to be recreated through joy. Originally it wasn't joy, it was freedom that Schiller was writing about. It's the ode to freedom. So everybody can feel pleasure. It's humans uniting in new ways with nature, all forming this kind of gigantic orchestra and being activated. And that's about nature making this possible, and song and imagination and poetry. But, as we've been saying, that's happening in the context of new mass spectacles, new machines and technologies of communication and experience. Nitrous is one of them. The mass-produced steam press is another. Poetry, which reaches people in new volumes because of this new technology. You can print many, many more copies. Standardized, reading becomes this new way of sharing states of mind for many, many more people as a new literate public. But also objects like this, connecting it back to theater, the panorama. These are altered states of consciousness. These are machines to transport you literally to places that you're not at any given moment, to take you to the Alps, to take you to the Battle of Waterloo. And there are these giant things in the middle of London for a few pence. You can have this kind of transport. And likewise, you can think about the orchestra, which is a brand new phenomenon, really. The collected orchestra, which is now we see as this classical form, didn't exist until around 1800, with Haydn and Beethoven basically agreeing upon what you need to have an orchestra. How many of each instrument does it take? And then how do you, Berlioz in France in the 1840s is writing about how do you compose for an orchestra. What are the personalities of each of these instruments, and how do you weave them together as the conductor or composer to make it a harmonic machine that you control, that produces very controlled effects that are tied to nature and tied to imagination, but are only possible, can only be accessed via this new kind of technology. And these new spaces, right? These new mass spaces to experience it. So Romantic poetry is inseparable from these new kinds of mass phenomena and the technologies that organize them. So some basic ideas of what Romantic science is. And Naturphilosophie, as I said, is the term that Schelling gives to it, which should, it sounds alien and strange in German, but that is just the German translation of natural philosophy, which is what everyone did from Aristotle up until about 1800, when the sciences start to splinter. So it's turning back to this search for unity. It requires questioning the grounds of knowledge, looking for order, purpose, growth, and mind in nature, the connection between mind and nature, and then there are a lot of consequences in the sciences. So I don't know how much detail it's worth going in on this, but I'll just say some of the things from my slides and interrupt me as you'd like. The fundamental starting point for Romantic science is Kant and questioning the limits of knowledge, but this really takes root in Jena, which is a college town in Germany, and the group of philosophers that are hanging out there, and Goethe passes through as well. So French Revolution, that sets the stage, and then Napoleon, basically in order to unify the French, he declared war on everybody else. And it worked for a couple decades. And they marched through Germany, or the German lands, Prussia, conquering as they went, and went right past this university town, this quiet little pastoral medieval town, where Hegel was, where Schelling was, where Novalis was as students, each of them as students. And Hegel famously said that he saw, as Napoleon's troops marched by, history on horseback. So this spirit, this force of history that will become central for Hegel's philosophy, was incarnate in the conquering revolutionary armies, these mechanized armies of Napoleon. Incredibly hierarchized, incredibly orderly, all marching together, but this is the new. This is the new era. So a bunch of dudes in Jena, going from 12 o'clock, Goethe at the top, Schiller, Alexander von Humboldt, who is an explorer, a naturalist, and botanist who invents ecology and winds up influencing Darwin quite a bit. Holderlin, or no, it's not Holderlin, Novalis, Schelling, Fichte, Hegel, and then Friedrich Schlegel, who's a philologist and literary critic. So to start with Novalis, has anybody read Penelope Fitzgerald's novel, The Blue Flower? If I can make a plug for that, it's this fantastic novel, which, pretty short, gets you inside the mind of the Jena Romantics, and it's all about Novalis's life. And it's written very close to him, and you kind of feel what he's about. He writes this Bildungsroman about a young man trying to find his destiny, and this young man keeps having this dream of the blue flower, which is a symbol for all of Romanticism, for German Romanticism in particular. It's this image that just haunts him. I never felt like this before. It's like I dreamt of it or had a vision of this flower in another world. I would think I was mad, so again, this connection with madness all along, if it weren't for the fact that my thoughts are so clear and connected and I understand new things. In the olden days, animals, rocks, and flowers spoke to humans. I have the thought that they have something to tell me, and I feel as if I could comprehend their speech. So the idea that non-human nature has a language and that it's already trying to speak to you, it's already trying to communicate back to you, and in the olden days it did. In the olden days that perfect circle of nature and humans communicating with each other existed. And in dreams and in poetry perhaps we can strive to return to that. But
Shelley, it definitely does.
It actually does, just as hello poet. But there's something about the impossibility too, the poignancy of it, that's pretty important to the German feeling tone of Romanticism, right? That you have this as the aspiration, but you also know you will never quite reach it, or you haven't yet reached it, and it's what lifts you on. It's in Goethe, it's the eternal feminine. It's the there's this ideal towards which you strive endlessly, and if you got there, you'd lose all the fun of it, or you'd lose all the emotion of it.